and I'm going to talk to you about some of the studies that we've been doing in our lab here at Stanford, understanding how we can use diet as a lever to improve our microbiota and our health. So I want to start with a picture of the microbiota or microbiome. I use both terms interchangeably so that we can get a visual on what exactly we're talking about. So in this image here, in the top left are all the bacteria that are residing in a colon. And these are all the little tiny jelly bean looking things that you see here. Those are all different types of bacteria. And in the bottom right of this image, those blue circles, those are nuclei of intestinal cells. So this is where the intestinal wall sits. And this green stripe that you see through the middle is the mucus layer that our intestinal cells secrete. And it's sort of like a fence that we've created. And we like to think of this fence in terms of the expression, good fences make good neighbors. If that fence is in good shape, then our microbes stay where they're supposed to stay within the lumen or the inside of our colon, versus when the intestinal mucus layer thins and there's concern that microbes can then penetrate that wall and get inside of our tissue, which is not where we want these microbes to be. So what we've learned over the past 20 years of really understanding more completely about our gut microbiota is that humans are in fact a walking ecosystem. We harbor trillions of microbes. In fact, close to 100 trillion reside just within our gut. And I hope that this image really gives you kind of a profound understanding of just how integrated these microbes are to our biology. They are sitting right next to our cells. There's lots of them, and they are as integrated into our biology as our heart would be, or liver, or any other organ. If we add up the total number of genes that the microbiota harbors, it's actually 100 times more genes than our own human genome. So if you want to think about yourself in sort of a genetic standpoint, from a genetic standpoint, we're actually more like 99% bacterial and only 1% human. And in my talk today, I'm going to talk about the promise of the microbiome as a therapeutic target, the connection between what all of us in the industrialized world harbor, this industrialized microbiome, and how we think that this is connected to a lot of diseases that we see rising in the West. And ask the question, can we modulate the microbiome in humans using diet? Diet is a great way to influence the microbiota because it is a change that we can make tomorrow. We don't have to wait for FDA approvals or long, expensive trials. So we're hoping that diet can be an important lever in controlling this community. And then finally, I'm going to end with some challenges that we're facing in maintaining a healthy microbiome. Okay, so as I've said, the microbiome is integrated into all aspects of human biology. Over the past 20 years, we've learned that this collection of bacteria don't just help us digest our food, they're actually integrated into our metabolism. So the calories that you're going to eat at dinner tonight, how many of those calories are stored as fat versus burned, is largely dictated by the species of microbes that you harbor within your gut. Your immune system. So we know that the bacteria within our gut can help us fight off intestinal infections, but it's much broader than that, and that we understand now that the microbes within our gut can also dictate how long we have a respiratory infection or whether or not we have seasonal allergies. And then finally, it appears that our microbiome is actually wired into our central nervous system, and there's been connections found between disruptions in the microbiome and diseases such as autism, mood disorders, and other central nervous system diseases. So I want to tell you about an experiment that was done about 15 years ago that I think really opened up the eyes of the scientific community and the lay community that really demonstrated how profoundly influential these microbes are in our health. And this was an experiment that was done while I was a postdoc at Washington University in St. Louis. And in this experiment, there were both lean and obese mice. And the microbiota from the lean mice was transplanted into mice that didn't have a microbiota at all. We call these germ-free mice. And in a separate isolator, there were obese mice, and the microbiota from the obese mice were transplanted into also germ-free mice. So these mice either harbored a lean microbiome or an obese microbiome. Other than that, these mice were treated identically. They ate the same types of food, the same amount of food, drank the same amount of water, no difference in the amount that they exercised or slept. But what we found was that the microbiota, that the mice that received the obese microbiota actually increased their body fat twice as much as the mice that received the lean microbiome. And this is despite them eating the exact same amounts of food. So this experiment really demonstrated the importance of these microbes. And not only are these microbes integrated into our biology, but here was an example of microbes actually causing a disease, obesity, a disease that we know many of us in the West are struggling with. So to explain a little bit about how this is possible, how bacteria that live in our gut can influence things that don't seem to be connected to our gut, I'm going to give you a little overview of how exactly the microbiome works. So we think about our gut as being colonized by bacteria, and that is true for the entirety of our digestive system. So starting in our mouth all the way to our anus, there's bacteria. But the majority of these microbes actually live within our colon or our large intestine. That's where I showed you that image with the really dense population of bacteria. That's within the colon. And so when we eat foods that have complex carbohydrates or dietary fiber, something like broccoli, those complex carbohydrates actually transit most of the way to the colon, mostly undigested. And that's because it turns out the human genome doesn't really encode much capacity for degrading these complex carbohydrates. We're really bad at doing that. So these complex carbohydrates make it from our mouth all the way to our colon pretty much intact. And once they reach our colon, they serve as food for our microbiome. So our bacteria consume these complex carbohydrates, and while they consume them, they excrete their microbial metabolites, their sort of waste products. And some of these microbial metabolites can actually transit through our intestinal lining and reach our circulation. So these small molecules, these drug-like molecules, some of them, are actually circulating throughout our body at all times, and these are microbial in origin. And we know that that these molecules can influence things like our ability to control blood glucose, satiety, and can improve our metabolism and immune system. Unfortunately, in the industrialized world, we don't eat a diet that's very rich in complex carbohydrates. Our diet is actually rich in another type of carbohydrates, simple carbohydrates. So these are things like sucrose, starch, fructose, glucose. These simple sugars, it turns out, our human genome is very well adapted to degrade these simple carbohydrates. They get absorbed early in our digestion in our small intestine, and these sugars can then enter our circulation. And this is where we run into troubles with things like insulin resistance, metabolic dysfunction, and increased inflammation. And so I didn't tell you what happens to the microbiome when it's not fed a diet rich in complex carbohydrates. And we were interested, our lab ourselves, in understanding what happens if you eat this diet that's very rich in simple sugars and doesn't have a lot of the complex carbohydrates that the microbiota relies on. So we had two groups of mice, one in which we fed them a fiber-rich diet, and the other that we fed a fiber-deficient diet. We didn't actually feed these mice donuts and soda, although they probably would have loved it. But the nutritional component of the diet was very similar to a donut and soda diet. And then we asked the question, what happens to the microbiota of these mice? And we took pictures similar to the one that I showed you at the beginning of the talk. So this is a cross-section of the colon from these mice. And if you look at the mice that were eating the fiber-rich diet, you can see the bacteria are on the right side, the sort of red little dots there. Those are the microbes. The yellow that you see there is actually plant cell wall material. This is the complex carbohydrates that the bacteria are consuming. And then what we found was that this mucus layer was actually quite thick. This was the good fences make good neighbors. And the immune system of the mouse seemed to be doing fairly well. In the fiber deficient mice, however, we saw that this mucus layer was actually quite thinned relative to the fiber-rich diet mice. And what appeared to be happening was, in the absence of complex carbohydrates from the diet, the microbes in the gut were forced to rely on the only complex carbohydrates that they had access to, which is found in that mucus lining. So it turns out the mucus lining actually contains quite a bit of rich complex carbohydrates that the microbes can use as a backup carbon source when we don't eat a fiber-rich diet. So if you eat a fiber-deficient diet, as was happening in these mice, the microbes, in fact, start eating you. You become the food source now for these bacteria because you haven't provided the plant-based complex carbohydrates that these microbes rely on. In addition to this thinning mucus that we saw in the fiber-deficient diet mice, we saw a bloom in mucus-degrading bacteria. So those microbes really took over in this situation. And in the mice, we also saw increased markers of inflammation, an indication that this was not beneficial for the health of the mouse. We know in the West and throughout the industrialized world that inflammation-driven diseases are rising. Childhood obesity, which has always been quite high in Western countries, is actually rising fairly quickly globally as well. So this is turning into not just an industrialized problem, but as countries around the globe adopt our lifestyle, we're seeing the effects of that in terms of disease and specifically childhood obesity. We know that immune disorders are rising in the industrialized world as well. Autoimmune diseases like Crohn's disease, asthma, type 1 diabetes, all rising quite rapidly.